Hello, I'm Zahirul Alam. Welcome you all on Frankly Speaking. Our guest today is Kang Siew Kheng, Regional Director of Singapore Tourism Board, STB, responsible for South Asia, Middle East and Africa region. She oversees the STB's promotion, marketing and developmental efforts. Ms. Kang Siew also represents and advocates the STB's interest at ASEAN and APEC. Siew Kheng is a political science graduate of the National University of Singapore and holds Master of Business Administration from the State University of New York at Buffalo. She is now in Dhaka and joins us at NTV studio on Frankly Speaking. Welcome, Siew Kheng.
Thank you.
Actually, we have invited you to share of your experience in tourism sector because we know that Singapore has developed itself in a very thirst industry, especially in tourism sector. So, first of all, would you please share your main purpose of visit here in Bangladesh?
Well, for us, Bangladesh is an emerging market. Okay. Last year, it contributed about 77,000 arrivals into Singapore. It's a small number, but in terms of growth, it represents something like 21%, which is one of the highest in the South Asia region, which I cover. So in that sense, I'm here to meet with members of the media, to meet with travel operators, to see how we can convey the message to our Bangladeshi visitors that Singapore is a tourism destination that's always transforming its tourism landscape, so that there's something for every visitor every time they visit.
Is it mere business visit, or you're trying to forge some partnership between the two countries?
Well, I'm here really to meet with the private sector here, which is the travel operators, the airlines, because as you know, tourism is a business that needs a lot of private sector interest. Without the connectivity between Singapore and other cities, without the airlines operating among these cities, I think tourism cannot happen. Without the travel operators selling the packages, you won't have tourism either. So in that sense, those are very important travel partners for me.
So, in your experience, how you have been able to develop such a huge, very thirst and robust tourism market across the world?
Well, I think we've been doing this for the last 40 years, and it's something that, it's a formula I think that has worked. And parts of the formula are that, first, I think private sector interest is very important. And so as a tourism organization, we talk a lot and frequently to our private sector in Singapore to see what the needs are, how we can develop the tourism infrastructure. And then on top of that, of course, I think it's very important as the tourism organization to also work with other government agencies in Singapore, because obviously, as I said, transport, infrastructure, those are things that are actually beyond the tourism body. You need the other agencies involved. And so there's, I guess you would call it the public-private sector cooperation that's very important. And then among the government agencies for us to all work together to make that happen.
So you're telling that the private sector partnership with the public sector, but the major areas is to develop a good infrastructural support.
Yes.
So that initiative must be taken by the government. What happened in Singapore?
Well, that you see, I think obviously Singapore as a city-state, it's not just about tourism. Yes. I mean, various government agencies work to make sure that Singapore is a good place to live in, to invest in as well, to do business in. And so there are very many agencies involved. There's a Ministry of Transportation that's involved in building good roads, making sure there's air access between Singapore and other countries. And then there is the an organization that looks after urban redevelopment of the city-state. And obviously they're looking at infrastructure that touches not just visitors, but it's obviously for people who live and work in Singapore. So in that sense, you have to work with all these different agencies and government organizations to give inputs on the development as we progress from the 60s to the 90s to the 21st century.
The organization you're working for, that is
Singapore
Tourism Board, is it owned or run by the state or some local?
It's what we call a statutory board. So it's part of the Ministry for Trade and Industry.
Okay.
That's our parent ministry. And so we, in that sense, come under the ambit of this ministry. So we are an economic development agency working for the interest of furthering tourism in Singapore.
So what type of support basically you're extending to the private sector from the Singapore Tourism Board?
Well, this is where we invite investors to invest in infrastructure. So as an example, when we first opened up the bidding for integrated resorts in Singapore, we had various companies that bidded for the project, and in the end it was awarded in the Marina Bay area in Singapore to Las Vegas Sands. So they're setting up the Marina Bay Sands. So there is private sector investment. Yeah, and then when we looked at Orchard Road and we wanted to make it one of the most exciting shopping streets or districts in Singapore, the government is involved in looking at the infrastructure, but we also had to talk to private sector, retail, international retailers to come in and invest in shopping space. So that again is public-private sector cooperation.
So how do you cooperate? How do you integrate each other?
Well, I think among the government agencies, we work together. There are always platforms for us to exchange ideas. And then with the private sector, it's conducting dialogues with them, really. We have regular consultative sessions with private sector to talk about what we see going forward in doing in tourism, and they give their inputs and ideas as well.
Do you have international collaborations like World Tourism Organizations or any other organizations?
Well, we participate in an organization called PATA, which is Pacific Asia Travel Association.
Okay.
And there we obviously we contribute something and we learn something from these international organizations.
So there has been ideas around the world that the poverty, to alleviate poverty alleviation, tourism industry can play a very good and significant role. So we know that Singapore is a city-state and you don't have much poverty in your society. So take into account the Singapore experience or your policies, how we can be benefited, what kind of actions we can take from learning some experience from your country.
Well, I think if you look, and I'm speaking in my personal capacity,
yes,
yeah? If you look worldwide, I think it's been found that tourism does contribute to alleviating poverty because it is one of those industries that really create a lot of jobs. Some of them could be lower skilled jobs, some of them could be higher skilled jobs, but they contribute jobs to the economy. Even for Singapore, when we look at tourism contribution to our GDP, we also look at contribution of jobs. But obviously we want to create higher value jobs. And so the government is very engaged in retraining workers, especially older workers, for the tourism industry as well. So I think there's a lot of positive spin-offs from tourism. If you want to call it alleviating poverty, that's one way of doing it. But I guess I would call it to contribution to the economy as a whole.
Yeah, in terms of employment also. What is the current state of employment in Singapore?
Well, our employment levels are high, and we have actually traditionally very little unemployment. And tourism is a sector that obviously requires also specialized skills. And this is where, as I said earlier, the government does invest in retraining of workers so that we can have well-trained people to service the tourism industry in particular.
We know that it's a considerable challenge for the country like Bangladesh, and we have been facing so many challenges in many fronts, but you know that Bangladesh it has also huge, immense potential in tourism sector in terms of natural beauty, its cultural heritage, its people, diversifying some areas. So do you think that Bangladesh can also be benefited from putting thirst in tourism sector?
Well, I think every country, when they look at the tourism sector, I think there are benefits to the economy. But I would imagine that every country is different. So in terms of strategizing for tourism growth, that would be different. Undoubtedly, I mean, I've not seen, unfortunately,
well, you haven't seen
your long beaches and your Sundarbans. I haven't seen that.
You should have.
But I know that, I mean, those are natural assets, obviously, that you can promote. So I think every government has a different situation that they're dealing with. So, you know, promoting tourism, I think definitely will benefit.
Siew Kheng, we're talking about how we can develop our tourism industry in Bangladesh, taking some experience from Singapore. So, you know that we have many natural places, especially the longest beach in the world. We have Sundarbans, the world's largest mangrove forest. So, from where we can start to make it internationalize and make it really worthy in the tourism sector?
Well, you know, I think it would be presumptuous of me to offer lessons, but I suppose
just learning something from your experience.
If you look at the Singapore experience, as I said, one of the strongest, I suppose, elements that or factors that was the reason for our success was this private-public sector cooperation that has worked for us in our case.
Do you have any government ownership in terms of running institutions, especially in tourism sector?
No, a lot of our attractions are actually run by private sector, and this is where I think, as a tourism body and as a national tourism organization working at developing tourism, we look more at the infrastructure and sort of making available the conditions for private sector to invest. So that because ultimately it has to make business sense. I mean, people who are investing want to make money, and so what we do is you know, provide the infrastructure and the climate for them to invest. So in that sense, Singapore, I think, has the advantage. We are very accessible to a huge population within a 5-hour radius. So as the economy grows, we tend to benefit from tourism inflows from these other economies as well.
So you have magnificent infrastructural facility in your country, but not being as a high-level tourism manager from the international organization, just being a tourist after your arrival, did you have any interest about learning or about watching or about seeing, about visiting Bangladeshi places? Do you have any intention?
Of course, of course. I mean, I think, you know, like, as I said, I've read about all the natural wonders.
Read many things,
I've read about the natural wonders that Bangladesh has to offer, and so in a
Sundarbans
sense,
and
in particular, in particular, and in that sense, I think we know that as a visitor, the minute you arrive, your contact with the facility, you know, the airport. And that's why, in a sense, this is beyond me as a tourism officer. I mean, the Singapore government has invested in building up a fantastic airport terminal. And that tends to be for people who arrive by air. That's one of your first experiences of the destination, the airport. And then, obviously, when you encounter, whether it's your public transportation worker, your taxi driver who takes you into town, those are people who contribute to the experience of the visitor, and which is why, as a tourism board, we are quite keen to look at manpower development. And that is where we work also with other government agencies, because obviously they look at manpower development on the national scale.
The manpower development process, is it short-term or purely academic, or some schools are there?
It's long-term. As I said, the agencies that deal with manpower development deal with it on a national level. For us, we look at it from the tourism level. So we're interested in the kind of skills, creation of manpower that would be able to service the tourism industry. So in that sense, I take it from a narrow perspective. But we work with the national agency that looks at manpower development as a whole. Yeah. So I guess what I'm trying to share is that in a sense, you imagine yourself as a visitor coming to any country. Those are the things that impact the visitor as he arrives, you know. The encounter at the airport, the encounter with, you know, your taxi drivers or even your service staff at the airport. So those things are very important. You arrive at your hotel, you know, whether those service staff are trained to greet visitors, to deal with visitors. So I think that's to us, a very important component of why we were successful too, building up the tourism service. And so every year, actually, we have a tourism awards night where we celebrate people who
from
contribute
tourism board.
From tourism board.
Okay.
We celebrate people who contribute to the tourism experience. So whether it's the best dining experience to the best tourist guide, we give recognition. I think that's important. It's important to give recognition to the people who contribute to the success of your destination too.
Okay, what steps or what actions you suggest to develop a just a beach city like Cox's Bazar in Chittagong? You know, you heard about that city. So, what are the measures we can take from our part to develop to attract the foreign tourist?
Well, I guess in our case, we also have beaches, not long beaches like you have, but we have beaches on Sentosa as well. And obviously, this is where we do need infrastructure to be developed, you know, whether you're talking about changing facilities by the beaches, things like that, you know, dining experiences around the beaches. So this is where
entertainment is one of the integral
you
part.
need private sector investment. You need people who want to do this as a business. And this is where, you know, I suppose this is where the public-private sector partnership becomes quite critical to the equation. Yeah.
So, do you have any plan to make any partnership between Bangladesh and Singapore?
Well,
in terms of establishing any institution or expanding some tourism bilateral sites or anything like that?
Well, we haven't looked at that. I suppose this is something you should ask our High Commissioner because he's overall in charge of bilateral relations. Yeah.
So, what are the other programs you are scheduled to maintain in Bangladesh in the next days?
Okay, we like to work closely with our travel partners here, so travel operators who sell packages, airlines who sell seats and packages. So we work quite closely with them in promoting the destination. Just to give you an example, you know, every year we have a shopping festival in the middle of the year, and we work with travel partners to profile that to Bangladeshis. And then last year, for instance, we also worked with school children to do an art competition, and then these art pieces are then sold to their parents, and in that sense then the proceeds that is received goes to a charity organization. So in that sense we look at also building relationships, you know, to various parts of Bangladeshi society. So
with this process, Singapore's tourism sector is getting developed day by day.
Yeah,
isn't it?
We hope so, because if you look at the overall growth in tourism, the numbers are very heartening. A recent PATA report showed that by the year 2010, there will be 500 million visitors just in Asia Pacific alone. So that growth is tremendous, and we want to be able to tap that growth as well.
Do you think the medical tourism on rise in Singapore right now?
Well, we do have a very good healthcare system, and
but it's very expensive or very costly.
Well, I think in healthcare we look at it in terms of the value, the reliability, the safety. So in that sense, I think there's no substitute for good treatment, and we've had very positive feedback from people who've gone to Singapore for treatment, and you know, and I think, you know, I mean, there's a money value obviously to treatment, but the service they get, I think, is priceless.
So very precisely, what suggestions you would like to give to Bangladesh tourism bosses, tourism policymakers, so that Bangladesh can also be benefited from looking into this matter, looking into this sector, and get thrived for Bangladesh? What type of suggestions you would like to give?
Well, I'm only a political science student, so I hesitate to give advice. Okay. So in that sense, you know, we can share some of the experiences we've had, you know, with people in Bangladesh as well.
So, and we're at the end of our program, so we'd like you share some of your feelings about Bangladeshi society, Bangladeshi people. What's your reactions about that?
Well, you know, as I said, I mean, I come to Bangladesh obviously to promote Singapore as a travel destination, but I think there's just so much to see here in Bangladesh, and I would definitely like to come back as a private visitor to enjoy the sights and sounds that Bangladesh offers. I think there's so much you have to offer.
please do come and visit Bangladesh. Thank you very much.
Thank you very
Sikkim.
much.
Thank you very
Bye-bye.
much. Dear viewers, as Siew Kheng said, it's a considerable challenge. It requires purposeful, well-directed action. Tourism will not address poverty automatically. It also requires commitment, political will, some good steps. Making poverty alleviation through tourism needs tourism policies and development plans. Tourism is one of the few industries in which many developing countries actually have a comparative advantage over developed countries in terms of cultural heritage, natural beauty, climate, its people, in many respects. In fact, that tourism is a labor-intensive industry, and which can provide jobs for women and young people, can open many related business opportunity and ultimately ensure development. So, to ensure sustainable tourism development, we believe and we hope, taking into account the experience of Singapore, we would be able to develop partnerships between public and private sector bodies in our country with a common aim of development. We thank you for watching and hope to see you on our next program. Until then, do take care and bye-bye.